The morning she realized her husband had never once asked her how she slept. Isadora was standing in the kitchen at 6:30, watching the kettle come to a boil. It was not a dramatic realization. There was no crash of understanding, no sudden ache behind the sternum. It came quietly, the way most true things do, as she counted back across 4 years of mornings and found the same silence in all of them. She poured the water. She set his cup on the saucer. She placed it at the head of the table where he always sat, and she told herself it didn't matter. She had been telling herself that for a very long time. Her name, before she became Mrs. Whitmore, had been Isadora Fenn, the younger daughter of a man who had loved his books more than his ledgers and left behind, when he died, a house with a leaking roof and a family name that still carried enough weight to matter at dinner parties, if not at the bank. She had been 22 when her mother began making quiet arrangements. She had been 23 when she met Leonard Whitmore for the second time, the first having been at a church social where he had spoken to her father for 40 minutes and not said a word to her directly. He was 31. He had a property outside the city, a solicitor's practice that his own father had built, and a manner that people mistook for reserve, but that Isadora recognized, even then, as something closer to indifference. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He simply moved through the world as though it were a series of problems to be administered. And she was one of them. The domestic one, the social one, the one that required a wife. She had said yes because her mother cried when she thought Isadora wasn't looking. She had said yes because the roof was leaking and the bank didn't care about dinner parties. And she had said yes, she would admit to herself only years later, because there was a small and stubborn part of her that believed she could reach him, that whatever lived behind the careful distance in his eyes was something worth finding. She was wrong about that, or perhaps she ran out of patience before she could be proven right. She was never entirely sure which. The wedding was small. The ceremony was efficient. Leonard's mother, Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, a woman who had opinions about table linens and the way other people breathed, sat in the front row and observed the proceedings with the expression of someone reviewing a contract she had not been consulted on, but was prepared to manage. On the evening of the wedding, Leonard told Isadora that he hoped she would be comfortable at Hartwell House, that she should feel free to make whatever changes she felt were necessary to the domestic arrangements, and that he typically rose at 6. That was the longest personal conversation they had for the next 3 weeks. She made the changes. That much she could do. She learned the house, the way you learn a language you were not born into, slowly, by necessity, by making small mistakes and correcting them quietly. She learned that the cook, Mrs. Beale, preferred to be left alone before noon, and would be loyal to whoever understood that. She learned that the groundskeeper, a man named Crofton, had been with the property since Leonard's father's time, and needed only to be asked his opinion once, to offer it for the rest of his life. She learned that the east parlor got the morning light, and that Leonard never went into it, and so she made it hers. She learned, in the way that women in such houses always learn, how to be useful without being noticed, how to arrange things so that they ran smoothly, and Leonard could move through his days uninterrupted, unburdened by the machinery of the life she was quietly operating on his behalf. He did not ask about the machinery, he did not appear to know it existed. What he did do, and this she understood within the first year, was talk about her to other people. Not cruelly, exactly, not with malice, but in the particular way of men who have organized their wives into a category, and forgotten to check whether the category still fits. She heard it first at a supper with 2 of his colleagues from the practice, a Mr. Aldrin and his wife, and a younger man named Griffith, who laughed too loudly at everything Leonard said. They were talking about some legislation, something to do with property law, and Griffith had made a joke about wives and inheritances. And Leonard had smiled, in a way that reached his eyes more than it usually did, and he had said, "Isadora leaves all of that to me. She's more comfortable with flowers and correspondence." And the men had laughed, and Mrs. Aldrin had smiled the way women smile when they are deciding whether to be offended later. Isadora had been sitting directly across the table. She had smiled too, because there was nothing else to do, and she had thought, "I balanced the household accounts this morning and identified an error in Crofton's supply order that would have cost us £40 before autumn." She did not say this. She poured the wine instead, and changed the subject to something that made Mrs. Aldrin laugh genuinely, and by the end of the evening everyone agreed she was delightful company. She was always delightful company. That was part of the machinery. The second year was harder than the first, in the particular way that things become harder once hope has finished its slow drain. She had stopped believing she would find something behind the distance in Leonard's eyes. She had not stopped looking. Hope is stubborn even at its most exhausted. But she had stopped expecting, and that distinction, small as it sounds, changed the texture of every morning. She began to notice things she had previously absorbed without examining. The way he left a room when she entered it without finishing his thought. The way he introduced her at social functions. Not unkindly, always correctly, but with a faint quality of completion in his voice, as if introducing her concluded some administrative task. The way he never asked what she was reading, though she was always reading, though the books she chose were sometimes left deliberately in his line of sight. She also noticed, that year, that she was becoming quieter. Not in the way of sadness, or not only that, but in the way of a person who has begun to conserve something, attention, energy, the specific warmth that you extend when you believe it will be received. She stopped offering opinions he hadn't asked for. She stopped suggesting dinner guests he might enjoy. She stopped leaving the books in his line of sight. And then, in the spring of the second year, her father's solicitor wrote to her. The letter was short. It informed her that among the items in her father's estate, a small trunk of books that had been in storage since his death, there was an envelope addressed to her in her father's hand. The solicitor apologized for the delay. The trunk had been sent to Leonard's study at his request, shortly after the wedding. The envelope had apparently been tucked inside one of the volumes and had only just been discovered when the books were finally catalogued. It took her 2 days to find the right moment to mention it to Leonard. He was at his desk when she did, and he looked up briefly and said he'd have his man look into it. The following week, she found the envelope on the hall table, with no note, having apparently been retrieved without comment. She took it to the east parlor. She sat in the morning light with it for a long time before she opened it. Her father had written it 2 months before she married. The handwriting was careful, which meant he had written it more than once. Her father always rushed the first draft of everything and copied it out slowly when it mattered. Isadora, he wrote, if you are reading this, then you have married and I am gone, and I find myself wanting to tell you something I did not say clearly enough while I had the chance. You have your mother's good sense and my bad habit of caring too much about the wrong things. I hope the good sense wins. I hope, more than anything, that whoever you have married is someone who already knows your worth. But if he does not, I want you to know that the not knowing is his failure, not yours. You were never too quiet. You were never too much. You were exactly right. I should have said so more often. I am sorry I didn't, your father. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her lap and looked at the light coming through the east window. And she did not cry, because the crying had already happened somewhere inside her, quietly, over the past 2 years, in installments she hadn't quite recognized as grief. What she felt instead was something clearer, something that had the quality of a decision, though she could not have named it yet. The 3rd year was the year she stopped pretending that maintenance was the same as contentment. She did not leave. She did not make scenes. She did not confide in anyone, not in her sister Hattie, who would have been sympathetic in ways that required too much explaining, not in Mrs. Aldrin, who was kind but observant in the particular way that made kindness complicated. She simply withdrew, not from the house, not from the functions, not from the smooth operation of the machinery. She withdrew from the effort of reaching. She stopped leaving the door open, between their sitting rooms in the evenings. She stopped attending the Thursday dinners at the Aldrin house, citing a persistent headache that became, after several weeks, simply understood as a preference. She was pleasant to Leonard. She was correct. She was what she had always been, outwardly, but the warmth that had previously animated the correctness, the small efforts she had made without being asked, the way she used to make sure his preferred newspaper was at the table before he came down, these things she let go, one at a time, so quietly that she was not sure he noticed. For a long time, she did not think he did. She had her own life then, in the ways that women build lives inside lives. She expanded her work for the Parish Relief Committee, which she had joined in the 1st year. She had started there in a minor capacity. Attendance records, donation ledgers. But by the 3rd year she was effectively running the quarterly distribution, negotiating directly with suppliers, and had organized a lending library for the families in the east quarter of the town that was operational, and already used by 43 households. She did this without mentioning it to Leonard except in passing, and he received it in passing, and that was the shape of things. She also, that year, met Annalise Drummond. Mrs. Drummond was the wife of a physician who had recently taken a practice near the parish, and she was the kind of woman who asked genuine questions and then actually waited for the answers. She and Isadora had been paired on the relief committee's planning board, and they became friends in the particular way that women who have been lonely for a while become friends, quickly and with a recognition that is almost disorienting in its relief. It was Mrs. Drummond who noticed first that Isadora never talked about her husband, not in the way of secrecy, but in the way of a subject so comprehensively set aside that even its absence had a shape. She said nothing for a long time. This was one of the things Isadora valued most about her. Leonard noticed in the autumn of the third year, not the withdrawal, or not all of it. He noticed a particular moment, specific and small, the way that first moments of noticing always are. He came home from the practice on a Thursday evening, earlier than expected, because a meeting had been rescheduled. He came through the front hall and heard, from the direction of the east parlor, laughter. Not polite laughter, not company laughter, but the unself-conscious kind, the kind that doesn't know it's being heard. He paused in the hall. Isadora was sitting with Mrs. Drummond. They were going over what appeared to be committee papers, but someone had said something, and Isadora was laughing the way that he stood very still in the hall, and understood this with a clarity he hadn't expected, the way that she had not laughed, in his presence, in a very long time, possibly ever. He went to his study without announcing himself. He sat at his desk. He did not open the file he had brought home. He sat with the peculiar feeling of a man who has just discovered that a room he thought was empty has had furniture in it all along, and that the furniture was moved there because no one expected him to look. He told himself this was not something to think about excessively. He told himself that wives had friends, that committees required collaboration, that laughter was not an indictment. He thought about it for the rest of the evening. He was not a man who changed quickly. This, at least, he knew about himself. He had been formed early and firmly by a father who expressed approval through the absence of criticism, and a mother who loved him in the way of people who love their idea of a person rather than the person themselves. He had learned to function within those parameters so completely that he had, for a long time, not questioned whether functioning was the same as living. He had married Isadora because she was intelligent, capable, well-suited, and because the alternative was to continue as he was indefinitely, which even he had recognized as a kind of stagnation. He had not married her expecting anything particular to happen between them. He had not married her expecting to be changed by it. He had not expected her to become, quietly and without announcement, the most competent person in the running of his house, his social life, and, he was beginning to understand, the parish relief infrastructure of half the county. He had not expected her laughter to sound like that. He admitted to himself over several weeks of not sleeping especially well, not expected to notice its absence until it was already gone. He began, carefully and without knowing how to do it well, to pay attention. He noticed that the Thursday dinners at the Aldrins had become couples' dinners at which he arrived alone, and that this had been true for some months, and that he had not thought to ask why. He noticed that she was home later 3 evenings a week, and that when she came in she had the particular quality of someone whose energy has been well spent rather than merely depleted. He noticed that she no longer left books on the side table near his chair. He had liked those books. He had not said so. He had, in fact, not opened most of them, but he had noticed them in the way that you notice things you have decided not to engage with, and their absence now had an edge to it that surprised him. He picked up one she had left behind, somehow overlooked when she cleared them, and he read it in his study over the course of a week. It was a history of land enclosure movements in the West counties. Dry in places, but with a section on the displacement of common laborers that he found himself returning to. It was, he thought, the kind of book that said something about the person who had chosen it. He had not previously thought about what her reading choices said about her. He thought about it now. In February, there was a gala held by the County Philanthropic Society, an annual event, attended by most of the significant families in their circle, and by the relief organizations they supported. Leonard had attended every year in a perfunctory capacity. He had assumed Isadora would attend alongside him, as she always had. She had agreed to attend, but she arrived at the hall separately, because she had come directly from a supply meeting on the east side of the city. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing with Mrs. Drummond and 2 members of the relief committee, and she was explaining something to a man Leonard didn't recognize. An older gentleman who was listening with the focused attention of someone who has been doing this long enough to know what genuine competence looks like. She was not performing. She was not making company conversation. She was talking about logistics. Supply chains, seasonal shortages, the problem of consistent distribution in the northern parishes. And she was talking about it with the ease of someone for whom this had long since stopped being a performance and become simply the thing she knew. Leonard stood at the edge of the room and watched his wife be known by other people. He understood, standing there, that he had made an accounting error. Not in the ledgers, which were always correct, but in the larger sum of things. He had looked at Isadora and tallied what was visible: capable wife, well-managed house, correct behavior at dinners. He had not looked at what the visible things were built on. He had not asked. He had told Griffith, 18 months ago, that she was more comfortable with flowers and correspondence. He had believed it when he said it. He believed it because it was easy to believe, because it required nothing of him, because it arranged her neatly into the category he had constructed and allowed him to stop looking. He had stopped looking. The older man she was speaking to laughed at something she said. A real laugh, the kind given to someone who has just said something genuinely witty, and she smiled in response, and Leonard felt something shift in his chest that was not quite guilt, and not quite longing, and was, he suspected, the beginning of understanding what both of those things were pointing at. He crossed the room. He came to stand beside her. She looked up at him with an expression that was polite and correct and entirely closed. He said, "Good evening," she said. "Good evening, Leonard." And the older man looked between them with the slight adjustment of expression that people make when they have suddenly understood the dynamic of something they had not previously seen clearly. Leonard extended his hand. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Leonard Whitmore." The man shook it. "Dr. Percival Kane. I've been working with your wife's committee for the past 8 months. She has built something quite remarkable. You must be very proud." Leonard looked at Isadora. Her face gave him nothing. "Yes," he said, and then he said it again because the first time hadn't been enough. "Yes, I am." He meant it. He had simply said it far too late, to a stranger, in a room full of people who already knew what he was only just discovering. He tried after that. He tried in the careful, halting way of a man who has never been taught how to reach towards someone and is working it out from first principles, with full knowledge that the learning itself is evidence of how long he went without trying. He asked about the committee. Not in the polite way, not the way that is really just a door held open for conversation to pass through, without anyone being required to walk through it. He asked specifically about the lending library, about the distribution model she had built, about what she had found most difficult. She answered him carefully, watching his face for the quality of his attention, and he held himself very still and gave her all of it, because the least he could do at this point was make sure she could see that he was listening. He stopped mentioning her to Griffith. This was small, and she would never know it, but it mattered to him. He started asking, in the evenings, how she had slept. The first time, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Surprise, he thought, and something sadder underneath it, and said that she had slept fine, thank you, and asked about his morning meeting, and he told her. And then she told him about the supply issue she had been working through, and he asked a follow-up question, and she answered it. And that was the first conversation they had in 4 years that had the quality of two people actually talking. It did not fix everything. He knew it wouldn't. He was not naive about the accumulation of what he had failed to do or notice or ask, and he was not willing to pretend that 2 months of paying attention could balance 4 years of its absence. He did not try to rush toward the warmth he had seen at the edge of the room and thought, foolishly, he might just go and take hold of. He waited. He showed up. He asked how she slept. Every morning, even when she gave him only a brief answer, and turned back to whatever she was reading. He asked because it was true. He did want to know, and because the asking was itself the thing he should have done all along, and it was the only way he could think of to show her that he understood the difference between then and now. There is a moment, in the life of a marriage that has been running on maintenance and silence, when something shifts. Not all at once, but in the way that ice shifts in late winter, imperceptibly and then suddenly. Isadora felt it first, because she was the one who had been watching most closely. It was a Thursday evening, and she had come home from the committee meeting to find Leonard in the east parlor. He was in the chair by the window. Her chair, the one she had claimed in the first year because the light was good, and he never came in there. And he was reading. The book was the one she had left behind, The History of Land Enclosure, and he had a pencil in his hand, and there were marks in the margin. He looked up when she came in. He did not leave, he said. "There's a section in the 3rd chapter I think you'll want to argue with me about." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in. She sat down in the other chair. She said, "Which part?" he told her. She disagreed with his reading of it, firmly and with specific reference to the primary sources the author had cited, and he listened, and then he revised his position partially and defended the remainder, and they talked about it for an hour and a quarter, and neither of them mentioned that this was the first time they had done this. Talked like two people interested in each other's minds, because naming it would have made it fragile, and neither of them wanted it to be fragile. She found the letter from her father that evening, in her desk. She had moved it there after reading it in the East Parlor, and she had not looked at it since. She read it again. She thought about what he had written. If he does not know your worth, the not knowing is his failure, not yours. She thought about the margins of the book, the pencil marks, the question in Leonard's voice when he disagreed with her, that said, genuinely, "Tell me why you think so." She folded the letter. She put it back. She did not show it to him. It wasn't his to read. But in the morning, when he came downstairs and asked how she had slept, she told him the truth, that she had slept badly, that she had been thinking about something, that she was tired. And he poured her coffee and set it in front of her and asked, simply, what she had been thinking about. And she told him some of it, not all of it, some, and he listened. The County Philanthropic Society held its spring reception on the last Saturday of April. It was a smaller event than the winter gala, less formal, more genuinely social, and it was, by the time they arrived, the first function that Isadora and Leonard had attended together in the full sense of the word, which is to say, together, in the way where you are paying attention to each other and not only to the room. She was wearing a blue dress he had not seen before. He told her so, which was the kind of observation he would not have made a year ago. She said, "I bought it in February. You didn't notice." He said, "I know. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said it was a very good February otherwise. He understood what she meant. He nodded. They went in. At some point in the evening, later, she would not remember exactly when. A colleague of Leonard's, a man named Burroughs, who had been present at several of those early dinners, pulled Leonard aside and said something that she couldn't hear. She saw Leonard's expression shift. She saw him say something back, and then he came to find her, and he took her hand, which he had not done in company, not in a way that was not purely ceremonial, for years. And he said, "Come with me for a moment." He brought her to where Burroughs and two other men from the practice were standing with several people from the county board, and he said, not to the group, but to Burroughs specifically, in a voice that was quiet but clear, "I believe I may have given you a misleading impression of my wife's interests and capabilities. I'd like to correct that." Burroughs looked confused. Leonard continued. He did not make it a performance. He did not exaggerate or perform contrition for an audience. He simply, and this, Isadora would think about later, in the East Parlor with her tea and her book, was the thing that cost him something and that he paid anyway, told the truth. He said that Isadora had built the county's most functional relief distribution network from what had been a disorganized and underfunded committee, that she had done it in 2 years and with very little acknowledgement, and that he had been among the people who had not acknowledged it, and he did not intend to continue being one of them. Burroughs made some sound of acknowledgement. The other men around him adjusted their expressions in various ways. One of them asked Isadora a direct question about the lending library model, and she answered it. And then they talked about the East Quarter distribution system, and Leonard stood beside her and was quiet and let her be the one who knew the most, because she did, and because standing beside her while she was known seemed, finally, like the right place for him to be. Later, in the carriage home, she said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "Yes, I did." She looked out the window at the dark going past. "Why now?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I have been wrong about what this marriage was, and I am trying to correct my understanding. I should have started earlier. I can't do that now, but I can start now." She did not say anything for a while. The carriage moved through the dark. The gas lamps came and went. She said finally, "I've been thinking about the east window. There's room for 2 chairs. He said, "I know. I put the second one there last week." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window, and his expression was not performing anything. Not remorse, not hope, not the expectation of forgiveness. He was simply there, in the carriage, in the dark, in the marriage, attending. She turned back to the window. She did not say anything else. But she did not move her hand from where it had come to rest on the seat between them, and he did not move his. And that was, not everything, but something. Enough, that night, to be called a beginning. And when they arrived home, the house was lit warm from within. Every window a quiet declaration that someone was expected. that someone was coming back, that there was inside those walls a life being built towards something neither of them had managed to name yet, but that both of them, finally, were looking at.